I think the biggest concern or challenge with container gardening is the watering. I always tell people if you want a lower maintenance container garden, always go with a larger size container because the smaller the container, the more rapidly it dries out.
If you're limited on space, don't have enough time or energy to care for a large garden, or simply don't want to plant more than you can consume, container gardening or raised bed gardening are great alternatives. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Johnson County, Dennis Patton, says the only difference between a traditional in-ground garden and container gardening or raised bed gardening is that you're doing it in a more confined space where you have more control. On today's Sound Living, Small Space Gardening. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman. According to Patton, container and raised bed gardening provide an opportunity to enjoy the same crops grown in a traditional garden, just on a smaller scale. Dennis, one of the things that continues to grow in popularity is container gardening, and I guess first of all, maybe just kind of a basic definition of that.
Well, that's a really good question. We throw that term around a lot, but container gardening basically means you're growing your crops, whatever it might be, vegetables, flowers, in some sort of container. So a flower pot, some sort of device that holds a mass of soil and, of course, has to have a drainage hole that then allows the plant to be grown. And, of course, there's many advantages to why people would want to grow in containers.
Yeah, go ahead. Talk about some of those advantages.
Well, I think, first of all, people that don't have space, is one reason. They can put them on their patio, on the front porch. Here again, are we growing containers for flowers, for vegetables? They both have a purpose. But containers are easier, maybe I should say, because you're maintaining a small space. You can use a good quality potting soil in the container that makes it easier to maintain. They go about just anywhere, they go full sun to shade, and, it's not all the stooping, bending, it's more dense, if you will, planted, and you get a lot of returns. So I think there's just a number of reasons why you'd want to use containers, and I think you're seeing more popularity as people begin to age, because you don't have to put a big old shovel in the soil and turn it. You use a trowel, those type of things, work in containers. So convenience, easy, lots of rewards, I think are the reason people would want to grow in a container.
You mentioned sun, and I'm thinking that probably really comes into play here because a lot of times these are people who may live in apartment complexes or places where they just don't have a lot of outdoor space. So that's one thing that they really need to take into consideration is how much sun are the flowers or the plants going to get?
Right. The good news when it comes to flowers, we have flower varieties that will pretty much do anything from full sun to full shade. The issue comes with people who want to do vegetable gardening in containers because most of our vegetable plants, especially the ones people prize like the tomatoes and peppers, are going to require probably 4, 6, 8 hours of sun a day. So that becomes a limiting factor. So I think one of the first things you need to assess when putting in a container gardening or starting one is what's your desired outcome, what do you want to grow, and then you need to match the plants for that location.
This is something that you would do each vegetable, for instance, in its own separate container?
Well, yes or no. It kind of depends on your style and your space and how many containers you want to maintain. But, a real common vegetable thing to do is this time of year to put, radishes, lettuce, spinach, those type of things in the container, those early spring crops, and then save room in the center of the pot to pop in your tomato or pepper plant come mid-May or so when it's pepper tomato planting time. And by that time, a lot of your spring crops are already kind of on the way out, so to speak, because they're cool weather crops. And then you can convert that pot from a spring planting to a summer planting. So it just depends how creative you want to get in your arrangement.
So really this is kind of like doing just a regular garden, and you've still got to plan everything out.
Yeah, really the only difference between a container gardening and a traditional in-ground garden is just that you're doing it in a more confined space where you have a little more control. I think the biggest concern or challenge with container gardening is the watering. I always tell people if you want a lower maintenance container garden, always go with a larger size container because the smaller the container, the more rapidly it dries out.
So how big can you go and still have it be considered a container garden?
You can go as big as you want because you're still containing, and I'm using air quotes there, you can't see on the radio, but you're still containing that soil mass. Now, if you get into something fairly good size, then you're going to be into what we call the raised beds. But when we think about a container, we're thinking about a pot, of some type, plastic, ceramic, wood. And, usually the container size, I tell people you want a little lower maintenance, probably stick with at least a 5-gallon bucket size. People can visualize that because that gives you enough mass of soil that you can grow a lot of different plants. And it also gives you a mass enough of soil that you're not going to be a slave to watering. The little 6-inch cute little pot on the patio table in a full sun location, that's going to be almost next to possible on a hot Kansas sunny day to keep that one well watered. So the bigger the better. Go big or go home, I guess they say.
Are there some things that you can do indoors as well? I'm thinking mainly along the herb line.
A lot of our herbs and things are extremely high sun-loving plants. So indoors over the winter months, you're going to have a pretty good southwest-facing window that you're not going to have any curtain shears. So you're going to get that really bright, direct light that will really help those herbs grow. And they're still going to grow better outdoors because, even on a sunny windowsill is no match to outdoor sunlight. But a lot of times you can maintain some of those plants over the winter months. Maybe get a little harvest here and there when it comes to herbs. But then I think they're going to really kick into gear once you put them back outside, once it warms up and you get those really nice sunny days.
I imagine you're starting to get this question already, but what do we start with? What are maybe some of the easiest things to grow in a container?
Well, here again, I think it goes back to size. In vegetables, lettuce, spinach, radishes. If you have a smaller vining tomato plant, will do nice, or a pepper plant in like that 5-gallon bucket-sized container. You might have to do some sort of caging or staking to hold them up and support them, but as long as you got the sunlight and, keep them well watered and well fertilized, it's pretty darn simple. I think where people fail on containers is they don't water enough and they maybe don't fertilize enough because we're putting so much water through that container. It does take a steady feed. And then also just using a good quality potting mix. We're not going to go dig up soil out of our backyard and put in a container. Because in Kansas, our soils are so heavy clay, they're not going to have the drainage they need to provide the aeration for the roots. So with containers, you almost always need to purchase what I call potting soil, potting mix that really doesn't have dirt, sand, silt, clay in it. It's basically organic matter that gives you that water holding capacity and aeration for good root development to give you good top growth.
You mentioned raised bed gardening earlier, and I'm wondering, is that one of the reasons that we're seeing more interest in that right now, simply because it's easier to control the soil composition?
Yeah, so the other, trend that's been going for a number of years is what we call raised bed gardening. And so this is constructing a container on the ground, so to speak. So the classic raised bed is maybe 4 feet wide, 8 feet long, and, it can be any length, but we usually try to go about 4 feet width because that way we can reach in from each side and harvest, maintain our garden without stepping on the soil. But when those raised beds are built, then usually we fill them with what we call an amended soil mix. So something that may be, 50% topsoil, 50% organic matter like compost. So here again, it's a great way to improve our typical Kansas heavy clay soils that tend to be really wet and hold water when it rains, or when they're dry, they're kind of hard as a rock. So by these amended soil mixes going into the raised bed, which is somewhere between 6 to 8 inches high, you've got a really nice soil profile that gives you good root development. And then the other advantage to raised beds is it forces what we call intensive planting. So we're planting every square inch of that raised bed to our crops, which means we're going to have less problems with weeds, which no one likes to hoe and weed a garden. And, square foot per square foot, we're going to get more return because of that intensive planting of raised beds. But it's really no different than gardening in-ground. It just is another way to kind of work around our soils and really concentrate those plantings. So here again, people with limited space can get a lot of production out of a small space.
I'm starting to see some of these offered commercially that are already pre-built. I assume that's one option, but I'm also starting to see some that seem like they're more elevated than that 6 to 8 inches that you're talking about.
There's so many variations out there. The typical is kind of like that because you can go to the lumberyard and get 3 8-foot boards, either 6 or 8 inches high, and then you have the 2 8-foot lengths. You cut the other board in half for the 4-foot widths, and so you've got a really simple raised bed. The potential issue with getting a lot higher raised bed is back to that desiccation, that drying out. because of that excellent drainage, just the sunlight, the heat of the bed, those type of things. But yeah, it's really up to what you're wanting to do with your space and how you want the design to look. The functionality as far as growing the crops are going to be the same, whether that bed's 6 inches high or 18 inches high. It just kind of depends on your inputs and desired outcomes.
Is this something that you could use some sort of a drip system with?
Yeah, that's the really nice thing about these smaller raised beds. You can do a drip system, or even low-tech, you can get what they call the soaker hoses, the weepy hoses, and you can just kind of snake that through the garden, so the hose is about, a foot apart. And then all I have to do is turn it on and let it water. It's pretty simple, kind of no-brainer. You can put a timer on your faucet if you want to, and you're good to go. So here again, that is another advantage because you're concentrating all that growth into a smaller space.
You said that you can plant a variety of crops. What are some things that we might put, I guess, maybe on the outside, and then what would be more suitable maybe for the interior portion?
A lot of raised beds, what some people will do on the side that doesn't block the sun, so kind of depending on how you got it orientated, they'll do some sort of trellising. So you could grow cucumbers up a vine, trellis, something along those lines. You definitely cage and stake your tomatoes so they take up less space. But here again, that same process I described, kind of interplanting with the container. So in that container, you could be this time of year putting in your lettuce, your spinach, your radishes, your onions, and maybe just leave a small, foot center open that you'd pop your tomato plant, your pepper plant in May. So you're using that same space, 2 to 3 times a year. You could also, go back and plant a fall garden crop in a lot of that original space. So I think it's kind of a combination of just really kind of planning out your garden to start with, how you want to utilize that space, how much you're going to be growing. Most families are now just growing for fresh eating. They're not doing as much canning and preserving. So, we're looking maybe at smaller quantities. If you are doing large quantities of can and preserve, then you need to kind of plan that out. But if you're just thinking for fresh eating, then you don't need as many plants to produce just for that need.
I guess along that same line, you would probably urge people to not get too carried away with making raised beds. You don't want to go to the lumber yard and get a whole bunch of lumber because you've still got to take care of all these crops.
That is really a good point. When I tell people, if you're new to vegetable gardening or you want to go with a raised bed, it starts slow. Make sure it's a hobby for you. You enjoy doing it, because the last thing you want to do is overwhelm yourself. Kind of what I just, talked about. What are your expectations? Or I'm just wanting some tomatoes for the family meal. Do I just want some fresh green beans along? Or do I want to can and preserve, which then kind of changes the scale of your garden a little bit? And so I think it's just kind of planning through. And of course, it's kind of a no-brainer. If your family's not going to eat it, don't plant it, that type of thing. Or maybe if you're limited on space, think about what you can get at the grocery store versus what tastes better coming out of your own garden. And of course, I keep coming back to tomatoes because we can't find a tomato from the grocery store that tastes anything like homegrown. But a zucchini squash from your raised bed is going to taste pretty similar to the zucchini squash from the grocery store. So you may opt to plant the tomatoes as opposed to the squash.
You have a number of publications on the Johnson County website. There are also master gardeners in Johnson County and all around Kansas. So when people have questions, there are places they can go and resources they can use.
Correct. Yeah, you mentioned the K-State publications. I can't recommend enough what's called the Kansas Garden Guide. And if you just Google Kansas Garden Guide, it comes up. But it is, in my estimation, the go-to resource for, senior gardeners. By senior, I mean experienced gardeners, or by the novice, the new gardener, because it has the cropping schedules, the timing, information in there, and it's just, I still look at it from time to time when I answer questions just to make sure I'm getting the information right.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Johnson County, Dennis Patton. For a free copy of the Kansas Garden Guide, visit the online K-State Research and Extension bookstore. For more information on container or raised bed gardening, contact your local county or district extension office or visit ksre.ksu.edu. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman, and this is the K-State Radio Network.